Evening, everyone. Oh, and we are recording. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Melissa Glaser. I'm the Executive Director of Teach Florida. Thank you for being here. We are here to discuss the pending looming lawsuit that is affecting the scholarship program. Many of you are here tonight because either you are parents or school administrators and you value the state scholarship that Teach Florida has successfully advocated for over the years. And we want to make sure that the 16,000 Jewish students that are using the state scholarships, which are over $130 million annually, stay protected and what we need to do to preserve this funding. So we have three amazing panelists with us tonight. We have Danny Aqua, Professor Avi Helfand, and Professor Nicole Garnett. Thank you for being with us. I'd like to just do a brief intro on our three panelists. For those that do not know, but I'm sure most of you do, Danny Aqua is the Director of Special Projects for Teach Florida. He has been with the organization for many years. He previously served as the Executive Director of Teach Florida, and he was a pivotal person in championing school choice in the state of Florida and getting universal access for every single child to now be able to get the scholarships. This year, Danny successfully spearheaded Teach Florida zoning law, where we were able to get a state preemption that allows schools of students of 150 students or less to be able to open schools as of right. This is a huge win for the Jewish community. We are now able to open schools and service more Jewish students, which was something that many schools and many families were burdened with not having enough seats to educate their children. So we helped get school choice 1.0, where we got the funding, and then school choice 2.0, we were trying to help make zoning regulation much easier for parents. So Danny spearheaded that huge victory. And as everyone probably knows, Danny is an expert in both state and national school choice. And with us also, we have Professor Avi Helfand. Professor Avi Helfand is a professor of law at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law and senior advisor to Teach Coalition. He's a national expert in constitutional law, religious liberty, and educational law, and he is the leading legal advocate of school choice and protecting scholarships for families nationwide. And last but not least, we have our special guest of the evening, Professor Nicole Garnett. She is the John P. Murphy Foundation Professor of Law at Notre Dame. She is an education policy expert and professor known on school choice and education reform. She has written extensively on vouchers, charter schools, and how policy decisions impact access to education opportunities. And she is widely respected at bridging academic research with real-world policy influencing national conversations on how to expand high-quality options for all students. It's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Thank you for being here, and I'm excited to help educate our parents on how this funding needs to stay intact and what we are going to do to make sure that we prevail. So I'd like to begin just giving a very brief overview on, to many of you, you know what Teach Florida is, but just in case we have some new faces here, Teach Florida has advocated and championed universal school choice since 2016. This year, we are receiving $130 million in state scholarship funding for over 16,000 students. Since inception, that's over $550 million in state funding for scholarships. And we also receive a Jewish security grant annually. And I am proud to announce that today we just found out that we made our budget of $20 million. And that is a huge, huge, big accomplishment. So we're very proud of the state of Florida for recognizing that, our needs and our security needs, and continuing to, prioritize the Jewish community. So with that, we will begin our session of how does this lawsuit really come to be? Why is this lawsuit happening? Why now? I'm going to start with Danny and ask you some questions. We know that on May 5th, the FEA, which is the state's largest teachers union, filed a lawsuit saying that the scholarships are unconstitutional. And if you could just give us a little bit of context and history on where the scholarships came from and what the past legal challenges looked like, and why now?
Sure. Thanks so much, Melissa. And it's really a pleasure. I feel honored to share the panel with two incredible professors and experts on this. So I won't talk too much about the legal side. I'll focus more on the Florida side. I've been advocating for a decade for Florida school choice, and there were many before me also advocating. And the day before the lawsuit dropped, we were discussing with a very large school choice coalition how people have forgotten what it's like to fight for school choice in Florida. And I remember the fight day by day, year by year, trying to change little elements of policy. And of course, some real legal challenges that set back Florida many years. And I want to start with those, right? Because those are important. So in the late 90s were the first initial voucher programs around the country. And Florida had two major programs. There was the Opportunity Scholarship, which allowed you to get a voucher if you wanted to send your child to a private school if you're in a failing public school district. And there was the McKay Scholarship, which allowed you to receive a voucher if your child had an IEP and you didn't feel the public school was able to fulfill their needs. And not surprisingly, there were lawsuits on those programs. And the famous case of Bush v. Holmes in 2006 came down and held that the Opportunity Scholarship was unconstitutional because it created essentially a parallel system that violated the uniformity clause, that we need a uniform system of public education in Florida under Article 9 of Florida's Constitution. But the McKay scholarship program has continued to exist and has not been overturned. And so I think what's very clear from that case is that it's not necessarily that a private school choice is not allowed. It's in general. But what happened was Florida wanted to allow more and more students to use scholarships. They pivoted to Florida tax credit. So instead of funding it directly from the government when you were in a failing school district, they would have corporations donate to a scholarship funding organization. Most of you know Step Up for Students, the largest in Florida, and then they would give out scholarships. And that program boomed and took off from 2001 and grew until it was challenged also by the teachers union in 2014 when there were almost 100,000 students already using it. And thankfully, the Florida Supreme Court said that they did not have standing to sue because there was no special injury. They were not harmed more than any other taxpayer because this money never came into the state's coffers. It wasn't being diverted from the public schools. Rather, this is money that corporations had chosen to donate. And then in 2018, we had a big problem because, and many of you remember, we did not have enough tax credit money to fund scholarships. There were 13,000 students on a wait list. Step Up and AAA had maxed out at about $700–800 million of corporate fundraising, and they couldn't provide more scholarships. So when Governor DeSantis ended up being elected and appointing 3 new Supreme Court justices in Florida in his first year, passed the Family Empowerment Scholarship Program, which was a program essentially for a lot of kids on the wait list that weren't able to get scholarships. We fully expected the teachers union to sue, but they did not. And I think one of the reasons they did not, and we don't really know exactly why, but they felt like the old legal precedent might not stand true today, and they would rather have that old legal precedent still, standing, and that people can use from around the country. I think Nicole might talk a little more about that. And so that Family Empowerment Scholarship has gone from small usership in 2019 to now universal allowance for 500,000 students in Florida now using this scholarship program. And I cannot, Melissa, I know you said, I'll tell you why it's now. I don't actually know why the teachers union has chosen now to sue. I saw Governor Bush wrote an op-ed calling it a Hail Mary, meaning kind of what are they going to lose at this point? But I think Nicole and Avi, you can talk a little about what it might mean for the nation. So that's just a brief background of kind of school choice growth in Florida.
Just amazing that there's over 500,000 school choice students right now in the state of Florida.
I might point out that it's really important for people in Florida that you may not know this, but there are about 1.5 million children in the United States who are participating in a private school choice program, which means that 1/3 of them are in Florida.
That's awesome. Definitely leading the way. We always say that here, but that's a real
It's really amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Especially because I lived through the disappointment of Bush versus Holmes, and Florida still just stepped up, and now it's just it's changing the world of school choice.
Yeah, we are very fortunate that Governor DeSantis really led that, universal school choice helm. Professor Helfand, can you walk us through the current lawsuit and the legal claims of what's happening? Give us break it down for us.
I'm happy to do that now that you've all made me feel extremely jealous that I don't live in Florida. So really appreciate that. I live in California.
Uh,
We have
we had enough of you. Okay.
We hope every day that we can just make a little bit of progress towards becoming having Florida school choice. In the interim, though, let me say a little bit about the lawsuit. Danny also already kind of alluded to some of this, and I'm going to try to break this down in a way that just gives you a sense of kind of what's at stake and just maybe a little bit of my sense as to why this isn't the strongest lawsuit in the world and why, in some ways, there may be more upside for Florida school choice than downside at the end of this story. So one way to think about this is that there are really two buckets of claims. And to do this, you have to be familiar with the Florida State Constitution, which I wasn't, and maybe many of you are. Some of you are school leaders here. I think Dr. Pearl, Gil Pearl, is on over here, and I'm sure in his school they teach the entirety of the state constitution to all their students, like all other great school leaders. But there are two provisions that I think are relevant. I'm just going to put on my reading glasses. And the first one is one that talks a little bit about, and you would think if you read it that it wasn't relevant, but there's a provision, Article 9 of the state constitution, that says adequate provision shall be made by law for a uniform, efficient, safe, secure, and high quality system of free public schools. Now, if you hear those words, you may say to yourself, what on earth does this have to do with school choice? It just is some sort of obligation from the state constitution that you have to provide certain a high quality public school education. And for those who make use of school choice, might simply say things like, "That's great. We love our $8,000 a year, and we'd love for you to, who don't use that, to have great public schools, and we're happy to invest and vote and have the state support your education, and you support our education." That is the kind of bedrock principle of educational pluralism. But using Bush v. Holmes, at least there's some way to read this old case to say what it actually means is that you're supposed to, the state in its constitution, it says we're supposed to provide this public education, and that's it. Meaning, what we're supposed to be doing is this is not just one thing we should do, but it is actually should be read as a limitation on how we ought to fund public schools. Now, when I say it like this, hopefully you understand pretty quickly what the counter argument is to this. And the counter argument simply is, I don't want to read it that way. I should want to read it as it's just simply saying fund public schools, make sure they're uniform and efficient and safe and secure and high quality. But the plaintiffs in this case have said no. What they've said is we're funding all these individuals. We're providing public funds for them to go to private schools. And those private schools aren't, in their view, safe, efficient, secure. They don't have the same regulations as public schools do. Of course not. They're private schools. That's part of the point. And therefore, you're not living up to this provision because we're funding you and you're not abiding by these requirements. And therefore, if you kind of squint at this constitutional provision, it just isn't quite enough. You are violating a provision of the state constitution. By the way, I should just make clear, when I'm going to say the word constitution in this conversation, we're talking about the state constitution, not the federal constitution. This is the state of Florida constitution. So that's kind of big bucket one of what we're talking about in this lawsuit. Big bucket two works a little bit differently. And big bucket two is there's a provision, another provision of Article 9 of the state constitution, where it says the income derived from the state school fund shall, and then ... be appropriated, but only to the support and maintenance of free public schools. So there's this thing called at least the Constitution refers to as the state school fund. And the state school fund, that money is supposed to go to public schools, not to anywhere else. And the plaintiffs in this case make an argument that works something along the following line. The state school fund goes into a bucket of money. Other buckets of money join in this kind of stew, what we might call a cholent of funds. And from that bigger pot, money goes out to fund the scholarship program. And the plaintiffs say, well, money from this state school fund went in, and money is going out to private schools, ergo, you're violating the state constitutional provision that says the money from this bucket should only go to public schools. Now, hopefully, when I say it like that, you also understand the very strong counter argument again, which is, why don't you just say that the money coming out is coming from the other streams of funding? In fact, there's plenty of money from the other streams of funding, at least right now, to cover these scholarships. There's no reason to assume that there's something inappropriate. Money is coming from the state school fund and going towards those scholarships. Those are the two, I would say, big arguments in this lawsuit. One can see weaknesses in the argument At least if you're just looking at the complaint, you can see the weaknesses of the argument. You can see as a result why nobody's brought this lawsuit quite yet. There are good reasons to think it might not be the strongest lawsuit. And hopefully you can see also what the responses look like. Danny, how did I do with explaining the different buckets of funding from under the
You did a fantastic job, and I would just emphasize that there's more than $12 billion of general revenue and only about 300 million of this dedicated public school funding. So I think the state can pretty easily say, and I look through the facts of the case, they're not showing, hey, we're proving you're using this money. I think the state's probably in good hands, but obviously that will be for the state to defend.
I think
So
it's
when I do
also
that,
it's very important. Even like the narrow Florida point is the Constitution says, and Bush versus Holmes kind of rejects this argument. The constitutional provision says the state shall provide for a uniform system of high quality schools, blah blah blah, and also other kinds of education. So it like the Constitution of Florida itself says that it recognizes the state should provide for K-12 education in other ways. And Bush versus Holmes, in my view, incorrectly ignores the second part of that constitutional provision.
So that leads us to you, where I want to ask, why are so many legal experts right now across the country looking at this case so closely? Are they wanting just to challenge Bush v. Holmes? Are they just like ready to bite at that? What do you think, is really piquing everyone's interest right now? Specifically, nationally, education freedom is a hot topic. So.
Right. So I think it's very important to, we might put this in a historical perspective. So the parental choice movement in the United States, it's a long arc of history, but the first school choice program, modern school choice program, is enacted in 90 in Wisconsin. The next year, Minnesota enacts the first charter school program. And it's actually really important to point out that this lawsuit also attacks charter schools and as being unconstitutional, not part of the uniform system of public schools or uniform schools in the state of Florida. So leaving aside charter schools, the first line of offense for opponents of school choice is this violates the federal constitutional establishment clause. And that is rejected in 2002 by the Supreme Court in a case called Zellman versus Simmons-Harris, which upholds a modest school choice program for poor kids in Cleveland. And then opponents of school choice pivot and they say, oh, well, it doesn't matter because state constitutional establishment provisions, sometimes called Blaine amendments, but state anti-establishment provisions that specifically target the funding of religious schools, sectarian schools. As my husband likes to say, sectarian is a dirty word for someone else's religion, particularly Catholics. But that violate this vouchers or whatever you want to call them violate these state Blaine amendments. And most state courts just say that's nonsense, it's not true. The Supreme Court in a series of recent cases have taken that argument off the table. They've basically ruled that if the state wants to extend benefits to private schools, it has to do so on an equal basis for religious and non-religious schools. So that leaves opponents of school choice with less good arguments. And the flavor of the month is this argument that school choice programs violate state constitutional provisions requiring states to establish public schools. And the argument goes something like this. The state constitution, Florida or other state, requires a system of public schools, so you can't do anything else. And the reason this Florida state court, Bush versus Holmes, this old case, and it's being challenged again, is so important is it is the only case basically to ever endorse this proposition. So we have pending litigation in Arkansas, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Ohio, Utah, and Idaho just rejected it. So all of these new programs are being challenged on the same ground that, wow, the state constitution says make public schools. So that implies you can't make other kinds of educational opportunities. doesn't make any sense. Actually, the fact that a state constitution tells the state to make public schools is actually good public policy. It doesn't mean they can't fund other kinds of educational opportunities. And every other court except for Florida has always endorsed the proposition that this is just like, well, you all are not lawyers except for me and Avi. So the expressio unius exclusio laturius proposition doesn't matter. The states it's just saying do something. It doesn't mean don't do other things. It's just like an order. So these cases are pending all over the United States, and all eyes are on Florida. I think this Florida Supreme Court will say that this is completely okay. I think, as to Danny's point, that the Florida ESA is it's very distinguishable from the scholarship at issue in Bush versus Holmes. But I think that the court will say the fact that the Florida Constitution says make public schools and make them good does not preclude alternatives is going to be a really, really important and pivotal moment for school choice in the United States, because the only thing that opponents have to hang their hat on right now in these other cases in the other state Supreme Courts is this errant, in my view, state Supreme Court case from the 90s in Florida.
Thank you for that. Professor Helfand, can you tell us what has the OU and Teach specifically done in the past when there have been other lawsuits? What have you done to help protect, school choice and education freedom when we've been at risk before?
Like a good lawyer, I'm not going to answer your question. I'm just going to follow up on something Nicole said because why not? If you one of the things that Nicole mentioned, I just think it's important for listeners to get a sense of this. Like, there's the small version of a win and the big version of a win. The small version of a win is, oh, that old program in Bush versus Holmes, that was about diverting funds. The way that program worked was you had a failing school. And if there's a failing school, the family could say, we're out, and money went with them to a new school. And one way to read that case is like it was all about diversion. Like, you're diverting money that was going to a public school to a private school. That's a bad thing. That violates the Constitution. And you might say this is something different. There's no diversion here. This money was always going somewhere else. So, like, it's just not like that case. That would be a small win. That would be like, this program's fine, but we're keeping the old rule about diversion. And that could have downstream effects, like if there's some other program, can you divert? How can you build programs? You still have a constraint. The big version is for the Florida courts to say, actually, that was nonsense, and we're getting rid of it, which would remove constraints on the kinds of programs you could have in Florida. And my
What does
interaction.
that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah,
Everyone
it's a
knows
really
I
great
like to
question.
dream big.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of programs, federal and state, that capture this intuition that when a public school is not doing right by a student, then they should have the right to move themselves and their resources to a better school. And that's the kind of thing, by the way, that can incentivize public schools to do better, that they know that you can move and you can take the money. So, like, take me seriously. Special needs programs. Nicole and I have worked a bunch on this. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in some ways, is premised in some of its architecture on this idea that if a state isn't providing what a special needs child needs, that they can move and they can get the tuition dollars and the services. And this old program from Bush versus Holmes was the same idea. So, to the extent you're dreaming up, listen, what I've learned about you all in Florida is I get phone calls and you have the most amazing and crazy ideas of things that you want to run with to provide extraordinary funding to all different types of communities, including the Jewish community in Florida. And the fewer constraints you have, obviously, the more creative you get to be. I swear, each time I get on the call with Danny, he's like playing like 12-dimensional chess with like somebody I've never even met. I don't even understand what's going on. It's the coolest thing. The fewer constraints that are in Danny's brain, the more ability you have to build programs that incentivize good behavior from government actors. So that's why, there's desire for a bigger win to take this down to say, no, diversion isn't a problem. And as Nicole said, and this may be of less interest to those of you in Florida who live in the promised land, but to the rest of us who are trying to make sure that the influence of Florida flows freely to all other states, obviously this precedent is something that people look to and something we'd like to get off the books. So those are kind of, some of the ways in which you can have smaller wins and bigger wins. I think most folks who look at this, and we would even guess the teachers union because they didn't file it particularly, initially when the scholarship program started, don't think this is a great case. And that's what I meant at the beginning when I said there's big upside here. The big upside is if you push the right buttons, maybe you can get a massive win. And a massive win could have significant effects. And that brings me to your question, Melissa, which is like, so what do we do? I'm going to audible for a second because I know we chatted before. Normally what I would say Teach Coalition does is one of the important things is I know courts are courts and law is law, but like galvanizing public support, writing. We've even had little gatherings. I don't want to call them they're rallies. Rallies is the word for them. Rallies outside a courthouse just to impress upon judges who are obviously only looking at the law, but for them to kind of peek out of the corner of their eye and understand that there are like a billion people who, one out of every three kids in some sort of school choice program are outside their door is probably something worth reminding everybody of and kind of the stakes of the case. So that's one thing. Sometimes the Teach Coalition will also file amicus briefs to try to express clearly why the Jewish community, the stakes are so high and what the interests are. And that's an opportunity also to express additional arguments and to support the defendants in this particular case. There also may be, Nicole and I were chatting, may be the possibility of bringing together a group of families to intervene in this case. And to the extent that there are folks, some folks that might have that on the mind, willing to potentially do that, I recommend them either reaching out to Melissa or Danny or me. I know that was a massive audible for you guys, and I hope you don't get your phones don't start ringing off the hook for the next couple of weeks. But there is some potential opportunity to intervene in the case and not Teach Coalition itself, but Teach Coalition maybe to hopefully coordinate some of that in order to fully express the needs of the Jewish community in Florida and really try to help support this litigation. And as I said, wins can come in different sizes, so the more support, the better.
So maybe it would be helpful, Avi, to just mention like what intervene means. So it would be parents to benefit from the program to actually become parties in support of the case. So that might be an option. I think.
Would that be only if we lose the case and file an appeal?
It would just be
already.
Yes. So.
Oh wow, Nicole, I
like
like
a
it.
model that has could have been perfected in a lot of school choice litigation. So if you have kids who are benefiting, you can ask Avi or me.
We have 16,000.
Yeah. So and there's very low cost, but I mean it's like like the human face of the litigation. 3,000?
Oh, I was saying 2 or 3 is what we need. So
We need
16.
2 or 3. We don't need 16,000.
That'll be a little bit much. So 2 or 3 would be potentially great. And as Nicole said, listen, Nicole's been doing this for quite some time and has been the architect of, I mean, she's pushed on some of the most important, like Carson v. Macon, one of the most important cases in the area. She was one of the first people to litigate it like years ago and has been pressing on this for quite some time. And when she talks about the what it means to perfect litigation, one of the challenges for a state often is like they look like a bunch of bureaucrats. And on the other side is like public school kids who were being manipulated into thinking are somehow being harmed by the fact that there's educational choice. And so sometimes the tactic is in order to express, to put a human face. Sometimes
I will say the teachers union is doing an excellent job at that. And that's actually one of the things that we're most shocked to see is that they're doing an excellent PR campaign right now at showing what this lawsuit is doing to those kids in public school and putting kids out there. So that's what we need to do. One of the next steps for Teach Florida is to really win also on the PR campaign and make sure that everyone knows how important the scholarships are to our community, how much they're affecting our children, what this funding is doing to allow families to pick the education choice that is best for their child. So that's our next big step at making sure that we really, we championed this, we have to defend this, and we have to just be out there to make sure that they know Teach Florida needs this for the community, and we are the ones that are going to help protect it.
I think there's nowhere better than Florida also to just like illustrate the incredible ecumenical empowering of educational pluralism. So you've got kids of all faiths, no faiths at all, participating in these programs, doing amazing things. Public schools participating. So now public schools are offering classes through the ESA. That public schools are offering space to micro schools and learning pods. You have anti Ron DeSantis learning pods. I mean, there is nothing more beautiful than educational pluralism and the flourishing of opportunity in in Florida, and I think the Jewish community in particular, as a non, I mean, I'm a Catholic. Um, we, I think you can find families that are they have some the kids at the yeshiva school, but they're also like using their ESA to do Talmud like learning with an online provider in Israel, and somebody might have a kid who needs is a CP who needs like equine therapy or speech therapy. And this program is benefiting these kids in so many ways that are not just funding schools, they're actually just funding kids. And Florida has just illustrated the beauty and power of educational pluralism. And that is why I hope this lawsuit ends in just like vanquishing that stupid opinion from all those years ago.
And I want to jump in because we had a couple of questions in the chat. I answered one in terms of who's representing each side in the case. As far as I know, the state hasn't hired outside counsel yet, but I put the name of the law firms for the unions in the chat. They're representing unions frequently, not just the teachers union, but other unions. But one question was, how does the charter school piece play into this? And I think that I want to take this and explain why. We asked earlier, why now? Why are they suing now? So charter schools and in Florida law are defined as public schools, right? But they have a very different set of standards. We can get a whole conversation of public-private, but they have many, many less regulations. And so the conversation is that, and the lawsuit is that they do not have the same standards, so they are not uniform, right? Everything's about uniformity and being the exact same. But again, of course, that would lose in the court of public opinion, saying we want one school that's exactly the same for every single child. But what the union has been doing, if you follow their social media feeds or what the press is putting out, is they're hammering in this sense that there's an unfair, uneven playing field between public, charter, and private, and therefore public schools are getting hurt. And this is something that we've been fighting off for the last few years in Tallahassee. So there was a bill last year that would have required private schools to write an IEP for every single child they admit before they even choose whether they're going to go to the school. There are other bills with certain the reading requirements or curricular requirements or admissions requirements. And there's a lot of conversation now, hey, we're giving all this money now to private schools. Well, shouldn't we account for and regulate for how this money is being spent? And I think that the teachers union has chosen now, in part, to lean into that, sliver of an opening for attacking school choice, because kind of like if they can't beat us one way, well, maybe they can beat us another way by over-regulating our schools to where we can become now like the overrated public schools. And you'll have a lot of private schools opting out of the programs because they don't want to participate anymore because they're too burdensome. So that's just a sense and a feeling we've gotten the last few years in Tallahassee, the sense that we're giving $4.5 billion now. And now, so we want to ask for more back, which I think there's certain elements, especially on the financial accountability side, that are fair because you want to make sure that there's no fraud, things like that. But that could be a reason why the union has chosen now. And that's what we have to fight back with on the PR campaign to show that our schools are fantastic. Our schools are great. They're not just people opening in shopping centers to take tuition dollars and get rich. And that's not how things work in the real world of running a school. It's very, very hard to get rich running schools. And so that's on the PR side, something we really, really want to focus on.
I think it's really important on this point to emphasize what we know about parental choice in education. And so one thing is Florida is like the poster child for the educational benefits for parental choice in education for all kinds of outcomes. And one of the things that we know is that parental choice in education benefits public schools. So I'm kind of an old school. Avi would laugh if I said I was an old school lefty. But I always thought like parental choice was just about rescuing poor kids from bad public schools. but I have actually come to understand that there's like, if you look at the evidence, competition works. And a lot of the evidence, especially from Florida, suggests that public schools improve when subjected to competition. So there are benefits for public schools from this opportunities for parents. There's more and more evidence from Florida in particular that you have kids, we don't really know exactly why. Um, Florida kids are doing better educationally overall. They're going to college, they're staying in college, they're graduating from college, and this amazing soup of educational innovations in Florida that it doesn't exist anywhere else. Charter schools and complete public school choice and private school choice is resulting in these incredible educational outcomes. So we shouldn't shy away from saying this is not hurt. It's not hurting the public schools. It's helping all kids in the state.
Definitely agree on that. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here and for Danny. We really appreciate, your insights and your expertise. And Teach Florida will help defend these scholarships. That is our priority. And, I think fighting this case with PR and op-eds and really just why Florida has been so successful is we've had the leadership to really champion this for our community. And we just have to get our voices heard, make sure that we vote, have elected officials that represent our needs. We are a grassroots organization at heart, and that is important to remember that when we need to get our voices heard, we must make sure that we go to the ballots, make sure we get registered to vote. That is the heart of, how school choice is going to make the change. And, to us, it's a pleasure having you here, and we look forward to celebrating when this lawsuit is over. One thing I would love to do is invite you both to come every year. We have a massive breakfast. 1,000 community members, the Jewish community, thank the legislators for school choice and for helping, with giving our scholarships and our protection. So I think it would be wonderful if you guys came as our guests. We'd love to have you guys this year. It'll
Great.
be in January. So hopefully by then, if there's a miracle, the
January
lawsuit
is a
will be
really
over.
good time to get away from South Bend, Indiana.
Exactly. California, not as much, but we always want him. So Avi, you are welcome too.
I
And
go
thank you
wherever
all for
Nicole goes.
joining.
Thanks so much. Bye
Take
bye.
care, everyone.